you can throw all the gun control in the world at it. Yes, it might stop some issues, some of the school shootings, but will it actually solve the problem of violence? Because it's not just gun violence. There's violence all over the place right now.
Yeah.
Why? Why is that? Why are people lashing out?
Well, in thinking about this over the last number of years, I keep coming back to something I ran into in the mid-1980s at the University of British Columbia when I was working there. And at that time, there was a discussion, and that's when I became aware of it. The discussion had probably been going on before then, but that's when it became public enough that I, as a non-sociologist and as a non-psychologist, just an average person, well, like everybody else, became aware of the discussion of nature versus nurture. And at that time, up for the most of human history and for many cultures, if you did something bad, if you did something wrong, you were usually held morally responsible for what you did. Or if there were other people involved, they also were held accountable for not only what you had did, but their role in what you had did. So there was personal accountability and responsibility. But I began to become aware in the mid-1980s that there is a discussion, or there's a trend growing. There's another school of thought, and the school of thought is that we're not actually, we're victims of the environment within which we live and within which we have grown up. Is that we're kind of start off as a nice pure white page, so to speak, a blank page, and then everything in our surroundings is what is to blame for our bad behaviors. So holding a person accountable and morally responsible began to shift to holding the surroundings morally accountable and responsible. And we are just victims, basically, of our upbringing and of our environment. So with that in mind, there was a massive shift, and it has continued to this day. So that I would say the bulk of responsibility, and I'm speaking in generalities here, for any wrong actions is shifted to circumstances or the environment. So in this case, in the case of what we observed here in Texas, is the immediate blame is placed not so much on the young man who did this, the 18-year-old who did it, but it's really placed on the access to firearms and the United States' Second Amendment and so on and so forth. So that thinking behind this is in this school of thought where it's you are a victim of your environment and of your upbringing, and not to be held moral responsibility for your actions, is that if we can only just clean up the environment, if we can only just stop these people, and I will define what I mean by these people just in a moment, because he fits a profile that's common to other people who have done such things. We could stop all of this by simply making it so he's not a victim of his environment. So when I say these people, what am I talking about here? I did a little bit of reading this morning on the personal life of this fellow, this 18-year-old. His father was non-existent in his life, it states. He did not live with his mother. He had what's called a troubled family life. He lived with his grandparents. He was a very shy fellow. He had a job at a restaurant, and basically they said, well, we all know each other. We all talk about things, but not this guy. He was always a loner. He was always too shy. He never engaged in our social discussion. And then I read that he was bullied at school, and there was one schoolmate in particular that enjoyed hitting him. That was one of the things he liked to do. And so when I look at this and I look at the psychological profiles of descriptions of other people who've done this similar things, they fall into this category of people who are basically they have a very poor, they have no social life or very little except for what is online. And they've been bullied, they're ostracized, they feel alienated from society, they have no real life friends. And we had a similar, well, not a similar, we had a massive incident in Toronto. It was a van attack that killed, I think it was, what was it, 11 people and injured 15 in Toronto, but he used a van. So as you mentioned, firearms are a lot harder to get a hold of in Canada, unless, of course, you want to get them illegally, and then it's remarkably easy to do that. But if you want to go about legally, there are a lot of we're pretty restricted here. But anybody can get a hold of a vehicle, and this is what this young man did. And again, when I was reading his description, he was socially isolated. He felt socially rejected by women, for example. 9 out of the 11 people he killed were actually women, just by driving down the sidewalk and running over people. And so this is what I fear. I fear that when we look at the environment, or we can say, well, if we can just make laws about this, and we can just do that, will it fix the problem? But then we observe that here and in France, there are other solutions to the lack of firearms or the lack of accessibility, and those can be just as bad. So what we really need to do in this situation, which I see very little discussion of, we need to take the actual situation that happened, and then we need to work backwards. We need to actually reverse engineer what's going on here in our society to see if we can see, okay, what was the underlying cause of this? Now, at the end of the day, he made a moral decision to do this, but people like that have always been around, maybe not in such quantity. And I think there's things happening in our civilization today that is actually promoting and increasing the amount of social ostracization, isolation, and so forth. For example, in Canada here, we had a very intentional campaign by the media and the government to shame and ostracize those people who were not vaccinated, to publicly shame them, to continue to ostracize them, to keep them alienated, and saying terrible things in the media about them. And what this has actually done is it promotes a division within a society, and that can be promoted in a number of ways, but we see it's increasing, not decreasing, this kind of alienation and bullying, so to speak. That's not just against him, but the bullying is going in other areas, and it's producing what some have, what is described in one description of what's going on here in Canada as what was it? The word rage was used, a silent rage of people who have been ostracized and alienated. So again, we have to look at, well, what's underneath this? Why is it that we feel the freedom to bully people? Now, we might not agree with the bullying that was done on him, but many people would agree with the bullying of the people who hadn't taken the vaccine. So what is it that makes us feel the freedom to denigrate people, to bully them, to make them set apart, to exclude them from social functions and so forth? Then we have to go even deeper still, because that's not necessarily the problem. What happens further down?